nobody there. My phone.
So just a brief introduction for the recording. Welcome everyone, those of you who are here right now with us and those of you who might join us later as part of viewing the recording of this session. Our task this morning is to take a look at the splitting of the Reed Sea and the crossing as described in this week's Parashah, and the look back at the plagues that occurred in Egypt in the past two Parashot and try to compare them, see which one, in your understanding and familiarity, seems to be more significant. And we suggested a few criteria by which to do this. One might be who is impacted by either of those, the plagues or the miracles. In what timely manner do those come about? How comparable are they to natural events as opposed to something that we might consider supernatural, the way we often describe a miracle? Okay, we'll give you another couple of minutes just to consider that, and then we'll try to share some thoughts on that. Okay, this isn't, of course, meant to be a major research project, just an opportunity to give some thought to something that we probably don't often think about. So I'm going to share Anna's comments first with you that she shared with us in the chat box. I think the 10 plagues are more significant because without them, the people of Israel would not have been freed, especially the last one. Most of them could be attributed to natural phenomena, but the slaying of the first one is certainly supernatural. Okay, great. Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Anyone else like to share? Go ahead, Sorrel.
Okay, I think, and I thought about this, it's.
I'll just, Anna and Brenda, can you hear Sorrel?
Hello?
Okay, just speak loudly.
Okay, I think it's not the 10 plagues, but it's the phenomena of how they were able to get across, move ahead toward the promised land, so to speak. And that there's a lot of physical things that they had to overcome. There's a lot of emotional or sensitivities that they had to learn and relearn and grow and change and adapt and I think that's the real phenomena. And they were dealing with tons of climate issues or changes, as well as running away or trying to run away from the Egyptians and the rough road that they had for so many years. And adaptation over time helped them move ahead, I guess, both physiologically, historically, and obviously with some sense of religion or acceptance of what they're going to be doing. And it was a newer generation, so that the old generation took them out, brought them forward, but new generation people who had to learn how to be people, good people. I can go on and on and on.
Okay.
About it for a long time.
All right. Anyone else? Maury, you had your hand up, I noticed.
Very simply, I was much more impressed, of course, with the parting of the sea because it was done by God. And the miracles that the 10 plagues was done by man. Some of them were Egyptians that also could do magic, turning a staff into a snake and so forth. So I was very impressed with the parting of the sea, and believing that it can only be done by God. It was apparently so. It was mentioned so in the Torah.
Even though in the Ten Commandments, Charlton Heston raises his hands and sea parts. But you're right. It's interesting because in the description, I think you're right. If we look at the description,
He's right. I forgot about that.
well, that may be Hollywood. Let's just take a look and see in the. So God does tell. There is a partnership here, because if we look at verse 13, it says, "Vayomer Adonai Moshe, ma titzak." Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward, and you lift up your rod and hold out your arm over the sea and split it, so that the Israelites may march into the sea on dry ground. And I will stiffen the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they will go after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his warriors, his chariots, and his horsemen." So there is kind of a partnership here. You're right that God, it seems to be the God who is involved in this, but it's through the mediation, the tasking of Moses lifting up his staff, the rod, in order for that to take place. So let me ask you this, Maury, since you raised that. Why do you think God needs Moses to raise his staff? Why doesn't God say, "Tell them to get going and I'll take care of the sea. You don't worry about it"? Why does God need the partnership of Moses?
He needs somebody visible. God is invisible.
Well, the people need a visible leader.
So the people, I think that's very significant. The people need something tangible, something they can see, and perhaps seeing the sea split without any trigger, any visible trigger. We don't know what that reaction might have been. They might say, "Oh, well, the wind's picked up, and that's what's happening." But if they don't see an actual trigger that they can associate cause and effect to, because God cannot be seen or perceived, and we don't get the sense that the voice of God is heard, at least here, by the Israelites. God is only speaking to Moses and Aaron, but not to the people of Israel. So giving these instructions and then something happening without any relation to cause probably would not have been as effective. And they are probably aware and recall, because it happened only in the last year or months, the plagues are always brought on by Moses or Aaron lifting the staff and saying that something's going to happen. So for that not to occur here, it may not have been as impactful and meaningful for the Israelites had they not seen Moses' involvement. Of course, God commands Moses to do that. And it says later on, so each time he asks Moses to raise his staff both to part the sea into these two walls, they're described as walls of water, and also to raise his staff in order for the water to return and flood and drown the Egyptians. Although it does say here, then Moses held out his arm over the sea, and the Lord drove back the sea. So it's an interesting combination. Moses is the visible trigger for the event, for the Israelites, but it's God. I mean, obviously, it's not Moses. Moses doesn't have that power. Moses is just God's front person. So the people can see somebody. So Moses held out his arm over the sea, and the Lord drove back the sea with a strong wind. The waters were split, and the Israelites, etc., etc., etc.
But the Lord is there all the time. God in the story, God is
present and active.
Significant in how they've made the story come to life.
At least as the editor of the Torah tries to tell.
Whether we recognize or believe or feel that there is a supernatural being on top or not, or he's part of the kahal, the people.
Okay, so it's a good comparison because we see that in both instances, Moses or Aaron, or both of them, need to be part of this picture, part of the implementation of the plagues or of the splitting of the sea. It's not just God shows up in some invisible manner and performs these acts. There has to be someone in both these instances that the Israelites can see, because after that miracle takes place, if you have no one with whom you've associated that miracle that you can see and follow, then you're going to feel lost. Even with that, of course, we know what the behavior of the Israelites was for 40 years and all the fetching already in this week's Parashah. Immediately after that, there's the issue of where's the food? They're already longing for the food they had in Egypt after they've seen these
Never
things. Take place.
satisfied.
Never, and not even at the initial stage.
What you're describing is a working partnership.
Well, that's what it seems to me from the text. I'm just going to share what Brenda wrote as well, to be fair. Most significant, crossing Yam Suf, truly a free nation, emphasized free, being led through the desert. God would be able for the Israelites to see all of his miracles, manna, water, protection from the elements. And what about Nachshon? Who was the first one to enter Yam Suf? So the miracle, although perhaps implemented by God, is triggered, at least in the eyes of the Israelites, by human action. Moses raising his arm, his staff, Nachshon, according to the Midrash, jumping into the waters first. There's actually an interesting Midrash that talks about the Israelites and the tribes arguing with one another. Who's going to go first? Who's going to jump first? It's not avoiding it. I'm going first. I'm going first. I'm going first. A very interesting counter Midrash to the one about Nachshon that we're most familiar with.
Sibling rivalry.
Yeah. So like why that impetus and initiative to try to be the first one, whether it's arrogance, tribal pride, whatever. In any case, it's a different way of looking at what might have happened in terms of the Midrashim. Okay, so we have this human action that really triggers things, as opposed to God or in partnership with God, who actually makes those events take place. Barb.
Maury, very interesting, your interpretation on both of those. Thanks very much. I found that fascinating, but not to sit on the fence. But I felt that I could not make a decision in terms of one being more important than the other, one being more significant or impactful. I felt that both of them affected the future of Judaism and the Jews and Israelis, and determined the future that we live now. And I think both of them in their own way had that effect. I can't say one was more important than the other.
So could you say a little bit more about how each of those had an effect and impact on the future of the Jewish people?
No.
Okay, fair enough. Maybe in general about the impact of miracles? Is that?
Oh, miracles is a whole question unto itself. And that's a real dilemma, because are they really miracles or are they natural environmental happenings that happen to take place at the same time? Were they simultaneous? So our interpretation of miracles is probably different, but I think impactful, yes.
So I think often there are different understandings from various commentators. We won't go into detail about that, but the understanding of miracles is not necessarily something that never happens in the natural world. It's not something that might not have happened. And there's always these attempts to explain how these various plagues, as well as the splitting of the Yam Suf, as well as the killing of the firstborn even, were not things that would not have occurred in nature, but it's the timeliness with which they occur, the ability to determine that something happens at a specific time because it has a purpose at that time by whoever brings that event on. So it's not that frogs don't appear in masses, or that locusts don't appear and destroy the land. It's just that when they're brought at a time for a very specific purpose, according to someone's agenda, that is a miracle. And it's not that you wouldn't get the impression that Moses or Aaron said, well, you know what, let's play around with this locust. It's that time of year where locusts usually appear. So if we can kind of time this right and say they're going to appear when we raise our staff, maybe we'll be lucky and they happen to show up right at the right time.
There's a
No.
generic question. Do Jews believe in miracles?
It's part of our tradition, of course. You speak with more traditionally oriented Jews, they'll say that those things do occur. We don't always see them, we're not always aware of them, and they don't have to be mass world or global impacting events to be considered miracles. They might say that the fact that the heart keeps pumping
Is that a miracle?
is a miracle. So they're different ways. That's a great question. You know, I don't want to delve into that right now, but that's certainly a question.
Theologians look at, do we believe in miracles?
Well, again,
Jews believe in miracles. It's a whole exposition on that.
yeah. So I don't want to go into that now. We're just trying to look at the impact that each of these may have had. So let me.
How do you explain this? It's not a miracle.
A phenomenon.
It's something that occurred at a time
At a
when it
set
was
time.
needed at that time. So, you know, the traditional
So
way,
was
however,
foreordained that? Was that foreordained that it was going to happen that way? Did man make it happen that way? Nature make it happen? I don't know.
great questions. Yeah. So that's part of the whole understanding of this narrative. What is, you know, something that's humanly induced or something that was induced and brought about by other factors, whether it be God or some other supernatural power. That's a little beyond the scope of our discussion today, although it's a fascinating one in and of itself, and maybe sometime we can look at that in a more general way. We just want to try to get a sense of which of these might, in your opinion, and it doesn't mean that there's a specific answer. It doesn't mean, well, you were right and you were wrong. No, it's obvious. No, it's not obvious. And we can have different criteria for determining what is more impactful. So does anyone else have anything they'd like to respond perhaps to that question? I just want to share a couple of additional things. So I offered a couple of criteria before.
Inspiration.
John, can I just ask you to call outside? We can hear you.
The present day leaders is what makes you jump into something that is very difficult.
Louder?
I'm thinking of 1948.
Can't hear.
More louder?
Or can you speak a little louder? I know it's,
I know.
Thank you.
no, I know. It's,
Sorry.
I think it gives inspiration to present day miracles. I know for a fact that 1948 war of independence, actually, I can't believe it, was a miracle. And David Ben Gurion was the one that jumped in and made the support was divided. General Marshall said, don't do it, you'll be wiped out.
mhm.
In the support at the time, which became the government, it was divided evenly. The chairman raised the vote. And the chairman was Ben Gurion, and he voted to go for it.
I think he's saying about.
They didn't have the guns, they didn't have the tanks, they didn't have the airplanes, fighter planes and so forth. They were attacked, we were attacked with all this stuff.
So that's part of our understanding of events. I mean, some of us attribute that to coincidence, some of us attribute that to,
But if we didn't believe in miracles, that wouldn't have happened. It would have been too cautious.
We could argue.
Nothing was it, jumped in, it wasn't cautious.
Interpretation.
yeah, we can always see, and I think that's often the basis of faith, that we're able to see things that can't be explained in a rational way or scientifically. But that's one way of looking at things. Even faith and science, and that's a whole discussion in itself, needs cancel one another out in certain understandings of events. But my purpose is not really to discuss whether miracles occur, but how we see the impact of what might be perceived as something fantastic or unusual, and how impactful that might be. So when we look at the Yam Suf crossing as well as the plagues, so who did it impact? The plagues, according to one, impact all of Egypt and all the Israelites because they were all witness to it. They could see these things happening. And when we read about God's intent for bringing on the plagues on the Egyptian, is so they would understand God's power. That's specifically what God says. In order for the Egyptians to understand, V'yadu, we read this morning, V'yadu ki ani Adonai. And this is what God talks about with regards to what's about to happen as well, the whole Exodus. Who witnesses the crossing of Yam Suf? The Israelites, of course. And so this V'yadu ki Adonai, they shall know that I am God, is for the benefit of the Israelites, because the Egyptians in Egypt do not see this. The Egyptians who drown have no one to tell it to. The only one who's left is Pharaoh, supposedly, who survives this, watching his army destroyed in the collapse of those walls of water on his charioteers. But the impact, in that sense, how much impact could Pharaoh have on explaining what happened to his people? They may say, oh, it's a military victory. Somehow they won. We don't know. You know, this fantastic tale you talk about walls of water. You know, we weren't there. We didn't witness that. So in a sense, interestingly, the plagues witnessed by everybody from both nations in one way or another might be said to have more of an impact. That's one perspective. With regards to Yam Suf, what's the long-term effect? The plagues are a nuisance, with the exception perhaps of the killing of the firstborn. They're all a nuisance. They're disruption of everyday life. But after they pass, they're gone. And people may remember it, but often we remember things that happened to us without the details, without seeing them as bad or as good as they may have been. It kind of fades on either side of the experience. Usually things are not as great as they were, or they're not as bad as they were, or sometimes the opposite. Sometimes we imagine things were much worse than they were, or much better than they might have been. But they're a passing thing. The Yam Suf destroyed. Pharaoh's army is destroyed, and that's not something that's just a passing disruption or distraction or inconvenience. That's a very lasting effect, and perhaps the impact on the Israelites as well, seeing not just people being temporarily inconvenienced by a plague or two or nine, but seeing people destroyed and annihilated by the power of God. That might be said to have something that's a much greater impact. And again, if you look at their behavior afterwards, you don't get that impression, because very quickly they forget these things.
So simplicity wise, is seeing is believing?
Well, at least for the generation that sees it,
Yeah.
we talk about trying to understand things that happen to us, whether great or traumatic and tragic. So when we talk about the Shoah, for example, how do we come to kind of any understanding, any possible understanding, if we didn't experience or see it, from those who did? But hearing about it only secondhand, or as will become the case more and more third hand, it's much less impactful upon us, despite all the ability to document and share historical events, which we have with the Shoah, because we have written testimony, we have film, so you can see things that occurred, but you're not seeing it happen in real time. You didn't see it happen. And so it's never the same impact of having witnessed something. And so perhaps the plagues, because of that, because everybody, at least in that generation, witnessed it visually, if not experiencing those plagues, because remember, the Israelites did not suffer from the plagues. They may have seen it going on off in the distance out of Goshen, but they didn't witness and experience it to themselves. They saw it happening to others. So that's another thing to consider. How did the Israelites, here's one other thing to consider. How did the Israelites respond to the plagues? How does it describe the response of the Israelites to the plagues?
Oh, such a good question. Do you know?
I don't know if it actually describes it. I mean, they lived through all those plagues.
They didn't experience them. They lived through them, seeing the Egyptians suffer, but they didn't live through
So
them,
they were just
They didn't
observers.
see.
if at all.
No different than when we see
Oh,
what
maybe
happens,
not.
Right.
even an accident or a God knows what on the street. We aren't living it internally or introspectively.
Doesn't
but we're
say.
seeing it and we're taking out of it certain experiences.
Beautiful. So what happens if you see somebody suffering a plague? When you walk by, we've talked about this before, when you walk by a homeless person on the street, you're not experiencing that homelessness, but you see somebody else in those circumstances. So what is your response?
Well, for some of us, it goes right to us.
Do you
For
do
others,
anything?
others of us can see it.
Walk right by.
It
Okay,
doesn't go in-
so I'm not
for-
gonna ask you personally how you, I'm just thinking of that.
I wanna know.
So what is the described response of the Israelites seeing the Egyptians suffer? Not from homelessness, but from all the other horrible things.
Yeah, it's just-
How does it describe their
Thank
response?
God it's not me.
Relief that something is finally happening to them because they have been slaves and
They
enduring
showed-
such
they
a
showed
terrible
no faith.
lifestyle.
Okay, so there are midrashim that address this, but in the Torah, it doesn't say a thing. The only thing we read of at some point is that Vaishaluk ish mera'ehu. They were told to go ask the Egyptians to give you gifts when you leave Egypt, and that's it. We don't read of any response. What's the response of the Israelites to the Yam Suf incident?
Oh, that drowned.
That they drowned, yeah. What's their response when they see them drowning? They saw it, they were standing,
But it doesn't
you know,
say.
whether it's as described by Hollywood, they're all sitting on a mountain watching the walls come crashing down. They must have seen something. It's not.
So is it like the others? They were silent? I mean, Jacob was silent and.
Oh, were they're all silent?
They-
No.
Did nobody respond in any way to that event?
All right, who did?
Write a story. I think they did.
Yes, tell us.
I can't find it. in
What
the
did we not
text.
read? What did we see?
ותיקח מרים הנביאה אחות אהרון את התוף בידה, ותצאנה כל הנשים אחריה בתופים ובמחולות. Then Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her and danced with
Oh, my
timbrels.
goodness.
So they were very happy. They were overjoyed
Wow.
that it wasn't me, it's them. So there's relief
Wow.
and probably some, I wouldn't say surprise, but some gratification that it happens that they deserve it. It's them, not us. We're okay. Let's get on with it.
So what I find fascinating is it describes what they did, doesn't describe what they felt.
No.
So they're celebrating. I mean, when you grab a timbrel and start dancing and chanting, that's an indication usually of celebration. Doesn't say how they felt, and we're all familiar with the midrash where God lambasts the angels for cheering on and celebrating as well. God says, how can you celebrate and sing and be happy when my creatures are dying here or have been annihilated, even if it's at my own hand, so to speak. So I bring this up because we talk about the impact when we see things happen, whether something good or something bad. You can see this from two perspectives. Something good happening that I'm not homeless. So when I see a homeless person, I'm going to celebrate, not because that person is suffering. I'm going to celebrate because I am not in that position. I'm fortunate enough to have been saved by literal walls, not walls of water, because I live within walls, physical walls. But it doesn't mean that I don't feel something for that person. I'm not celebrating their situation. So perhaps when Miriam and the women start dancing and banging their tambourines, timbrels, they're celebrating because they realize how lucky they are that they're on the right side of this battle, that they have been fortunate enough to be freed from slavery, and maybe not celebrating the death and the destruction of Pharaoh's army, but they're celebrating their situation. And perhaps afterwards, although we don't really see that in the Torah, then there's more of an understanding and greater empathy from what could have happened because they've been slaves. They know what it's like to be tortured, to be assaulted, to be oppressed. And now they're seeing their oppressors suffer, but that may not eventually have given them any great joy. And so when we see somebody suffering, and lahavdil, as they say, to differentiate, and when we see somebody, a homeless person suffering, it's not because that person oppressed us in any way. It's a very different situation. But there is an element of celebration for us not being in that situation, but there should also be an element of sadness and perhaps motivation to action because that person is not in a good situation. That's probably not what the Israelites felt. They probably didn't. Well, let me not show. I'm sure it didn't say I'm going to jump back into the water and try to save something. I doubt that happened. There's no redress to that effect. But the impact things have on others, probably, and this is why I think, in a sense, that the Yam Suf had greater impact. It had an impact on, hopefully, the future of the Jewish people. Not necessarily on that generation, but on our ability to understand events from different perspectives. So when we look at that event, as opposed to the plagues you say, they suffered for a few days, whatever. It's not a big deal. They had it coming to them. You don't really feel any empathy for them. But the Yam Suf, when you see the total destruction of who knows how many thousands of charioteers, and you can say it's an army, it's war. People get killed in war. But hopefully, the impact on us is not just because that's an element and an indication of our final movement to freedom. Because without that army, that's it. That's the last we're going to see of Pharaoh and his army. And that's probably not what they felt after the plagues. Pharaoh's still around, his army's still. But hopefully we can see beyond that freedom for us, how that impacts others and how we respond to the suffering of others as well. So that's why I see that Yam Suf as something that has potential for greater impact than the plagues.
So if we look at the whole concept of homelessness in our own city, in our own community, and our own reactions to the encampments and the inability of the system to provide for them, or their inability to take what the system can or should provide for them, and then the whole conglomeration and the mix of those two elements taken out of the Yam Suf story, and how do people react to real serious crises or situations that are life-threatening. And that's a whole story and a whole learning that you hope to get out of this.
And I'd go further and see another element with the Yam Suf story along the lines of what you're saying. So in the Yam Suf story, it makes sense for us in a sense to blame those victims. They were our oppressors. But sometimes when we see a homeless person, sometimes we blame them. Why can't they just get up? Why don't they just find a job? Why don't they just go to a shelter? Like, why?
They can't go to the shelter because the shelter won't take them.
Well, so it's a lot of their fault as well. Why can't they just? Why don't they do something? Like, get off their ass and do something with your life. So that sounds horribly harsh, but that's a lot of the times that's the way we feel. We look at those people. We don't want to deal with their despair and pain, and so we want to put blame or at least responsibility on them as well. Not totally, but certainly to a large extent. And say, well, if they can't get up and go find a job, why should I bother? That's their issue.
I can tell you that's my reaction to those that are standing at the corners at the streetlights begging. Because there's a system that will provide for them, but they're still collecting, and they're not such tragic situations.
Well, we don't know. Well, we don't know what they're
Terrible.
No, I'm not saying you're terrible. But I'm just saying we don't always know what their circumstances are.
Coming back from the airport 2 weeks ago, the driver,
He actually took
He
money
took
out.
out
to
money
give them.
out.
He says,
I
I
was gonna
always
give him
give
lots
them
of
the
money
quarter
anyway.
young,
And he gave it to
so
the guy in
gave
the
you,
corner.
and
I
the
thought,
poor one.
and I said something, he said, shut up. Because that's not gonna help them. That's a whole other issue. Get out of their misery.
Okay, so
That's me.
Wow, have you ever opened up?
you're right, because
Wonderful.
She's right, but she's wrong. I can
it's
say
a great
that.
argument, and there's nothing wrong with each of us seeing different ways how we can either momentarily or sustainably help people who are in those disparate
There are,
situations.
so to bring it to the present day, there are people who are homeless, who cannot accept, will not, cannot, a lot of different reasons, psychological, behavioral, all kinds of things. The help that would get them to a better place. It's very simple. You go out and give them the place. I've been in that situation, and they will not.
Well, they don't know how to take it. They're
No,
on
no, not just they
psychological,
can't take it. They
That's
don't
right,
know,
they
and
can't.
They're just psychologically, emotionally,
Yeah. You don't know what they've been
physically, everything
through.
else. They're not,
in their
they're not
life.
ready to
So-
take.
So I think that's exactly why we can have an approach, an idea of how these things work. But you have to examine each case. You can't
They're all
say
different, separate.
we shouldn't be giving the money on the corner. That's not gonna help them. And that may be true for the majority, but if there is one person there who, for whatever reasons, that's gonna help them momentarily. I mean, I don't hesitate to say this. I've got change in my car all the time. I just wait for the opportunity for somebody. And I'm gonna finish this, I gotta go. My idea of this is that if anyone feels forced or is willing to stand out in the cold at a place, and in what we term, not for them perhaps, in the challenge to their dignity, have to go out with a Tim Hortons coffee cup and ask for some change, I have it, I'm gonna give it to them. Believe me, that $2, whatever I give them, is gonna help them a lot more than it's gonna help me. And that's my criterion at that very moment. I don't need that $2. They can use it. They're not gonna become millionaires from that. But they may be able to buy a cup of coffee. Anyway, I'm gonna have to end on that because I gotta get going. Thank you all for your honest discussion. And Brenda, and I'm sorry I didn't give you as fair an opportunity to express
That's
yourselves.
okay. I just had one more
Yeah,
comment in the
I-
chat box,
Michael,
Michael.
that's a good way to
When-
get rid of
when-
all that garbage.
You
When-
bring it to me, I'll hand it out.
No, I think
And what is the
dimes
basic?
and nickels.
So, all right, Brenda and Ann, I'll give you one last chance to,
So, I can't
just
hear.
one second, let me
He's
just,
talking.
I'm just gonna knock off this one. 1 second, don't talk yet, don't talk yet.
go ahead.
Okay,
Okay, I was just gonna say the last comment I put in the chat box is when the Egyptians were drowning, the angels were singing, and didn't God chastise the angels for singing when his children were drowning?
Right,
yeah.
right.
True. And our perspective from Judaism is if you save one life, you're saving like the whole world. What is that thing that we're talking
Yeah.
about? So giving to one person is a start. Take care.
Anyway, thank you all very much. My apologies for having to rush away.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Always good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Anna, safe travels. Enjoy Hawaii.
Thank you. Bye.
And if you feel like getting up at 3 in the morning to join us one day, that'd be great.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Take care, Michael. Thank you.
Good. Thank you all.
You register for the town hall.